All right, we're rolling again.
Okay.
What work changes or impacts resulting from the pandemic have you most enjoyed or disliked?
Let's see. I'll start with disliked. I've most disliked that, particularly during the period of the pandemic when people were really separated, that there was a complete loss of any casual interaction. That any interaction you had with anybody had to be scheduled. Everybody had to, sign on to Zoom at the same time. So the opportunities just to collaborate, to have a discussion that you would have with somebody in the hallway over a cup of coffee, and oftentimes those are when the really best ideas happen, or new ideas, or just having that interaction. That's what I dislike the most, and I think as we still sometimes gravitate towards Zoom because it's convenient, or if we're doing remote working a lot, what I personally miss is that opportunity for casual interaction, just to walk down the hall and have a conversation with somebody. What I liked about it, conversely, and it might sound like I'm contradicting myself, is there is flexibility. So if you want to set up a meeting or have an interaction with somebody who's across the country, or people in several different places, it's much easier to do that now. So you can actually have conversations and bring experiences in for students or for a group and get all these different voices that prior to this you would have to do either some kind of a phone call, or somebody would have to fly in, or all of those kinds of things. So the fact that it's broadened our world a little bit is great, but the downside to me will always be, I'd just rather than sending you an email, I would like to just walk down and have a conversation. And so now that we're back to that more or less, that's what I'm very happy for.
How do you think the pandemic impacted IUP and IUP's relationship with the community?
It's interesting. I think, there are several initiatives that IUP engaged in pretty quickly that I think really enhanced its connection to the community. The work that our biology department did with IRMC in terms of early COVID testing was tremendously impactful for everyone, and certainly that IUP was making this great contribution. There's also the wastewater, sort of testing the wastewater that comes in Indiana Borough that IUP is connected to, so you can sort of get a hint ahead of time of where in the wastewater that you could see the virus, sort of starting to expand. So I think that was tremendously helpful to the community. So, IUP really showed itself as a resource. I think, in terms of outreach beyond that, I think, everyone was so isolated at the beginning, so I think nobody was really connecting. So I think now what I'm experiencing and finding is again finding those opportunities to reconnect. So so I was at the basketball game last night, and there were a lot of community members there. I'm puzzled that there aren't more students there. I think it would be great if more students came, but you can see that sort of return to the community, looking to IUP as a place to kind of interact with, which is great. So, but obviously I think we want to keep doing more of that, because that relationship is really important, and I think we have to keep nurturing it.
Now that life has somewhat returned to normal, how have your priorities, projects, and job responsibilities evolved?
Well, that's interesting, because it's a multi-layered question and response. So as I mentioned earlier, when I first came, I came to be Dean of the College of Fine Arts. And then during the second year that I was here is when we started to do the reorganization. So with the merger of the colleges, so during the period of COVID and coming through COVID, is when the College of Fine Arts and the College of Humanities and Social Sciences more or less combined into the College of Arts and Humanities. So my job basically completely changed during the course of this time. So as I reflect back on my time at IUP, from July 2019 till now, it's been a period of constant change. Some change that I had looked for and anticipated, but a lot of change I didn't anticipate at all. Obviously no one anticipated COVID. But also, I think at that time, no one anticipated, or few people anticipated, that IUP would reorganize itself as much as it did, that we would unfortunately have to retrench faculty the way that we did, that, that all of these changes would happen. So I think that the story of this time for me is it's really been about constant change. So I think that's part of my reflecting on normal, because I don't know that I know what normal would be yet, because it really it's been a constant adapting to new things, which is great and exciting in some ways, but it can be challenging, and it's just like everybody who experiences change all the time, it can be really exhausting, because just when you think you've got a handle on something, then something else changes. Mm-hmm. So as my time at IUP is done, I'm sure I'll look back on that this time and just kind of reflect on all that happened during this time, COVID and everything else together.
How has the pandemic affected your life?
Oh, well, I think, I would say initially one of the things that for me personally, and I mentioned this earlier, as someone who I was a music major at IUP. That's and I kept going down that road, and my major instrument was voice. So I was a singer. I made a living as a singer for a while. When I got back into teaching, when I taught voice. I sang professionally for years and years. So the idea that this thing that was so much a part of who I was and what I did suddenly became one of the most dangerous things that anybody could do, was really kind of earth-shattering for me. It took me a while to figure out how to even be in that space, because I thought, well, can no one do this again? I mean, because nobody knew. So that was pretty profound for me, and just kind of navigating through that. I think now one of the interesting things is, for me personally, is how it affected various relationships that one has. So, my experience, and I think it might be the experience of other people too, is the people that you have a closer relationship with, that you found ways to maintain through phone call or texting or a Zoom or something like that, were perhaps strengthened somewhat, but the casual acquaintances that you had, if you just would go somewhere to hang out and people would be there that you knew, and you would see them in that context, or you were on a team with them or in an ensemble with them or whatever, you weren't going to see them as much. So I think people started to drift apart from those relationships, and I think they're just trying to figure out how to get back to them. So it's I can see that in terms of how people choose or don't choose to participate in things, because I, like everybody else, we spend a lot of time on our phones or just texting or whatever, but we're not really interacting. So now I'm reminding myself that I should make the effort to go somewhere to just kind of interact with people. There's one anecdotally, I remember there was when we were just coming out of COVID, there was a gathering at Levity down the road. It was to celebrate former Dean Asamoah's retirement, and it was the first event that I'd been to since COVID started, where a big group of people got together, and people were so excited to be together, nobody wanted to leave. People were just having the best time because they just wanted that interaction. So I think finding ways to remind ourselves that it's worth getting out of your house, it's worth going and being with people, and to really enjoy that, because they could be taken away as something like this happens again.
When, if ever, did the pandemic first feel real to you?
I think there were two things. Number one is the thing I shared earlier about being the last person to leave Sprouse and collecting the masks. I think the other thing was, in Pittsburgh, we live on the south side of Pittsburgh, down by the river just off of East Carson Street. And East Carson Street is, it's always packed. It's always busy. There's a lot of bars and restaurants and a lot of traffic. So it's always very active. And the first weekend when everything shut down, we went for a walk, and there was nobody there. There was no traffic. All the businesses were closed. I remember walking out in the middle of East Carson Street and just taking a picture in both directions, because it was like some science fiction movie where everybody, left and you were the last person left in whatever that area was. So it was really surreal, and it really brought home the idea of, this is where we are right now. So I think I'll always remember that moment, because it was such a change from my normal experience in that neighborhood where, we've been for like 22 years, and it's just always packed. And, now it's back to being packed. But it was pretty crazy to have it be absolutely dead.
Definitely. How did the pandemic affect your perspective, attitudes about the community, employment, economics, society in general, or politics?
Oh, that's a big question. I think one of the things that we're still learning and navigating out of that is that, and some of this is related to how people receive and process information and how they curate it for themselves. So, people even before that sort of tended to navigate their world, particularly in social media, in terms of these are all the people that think like me. I get my news from a place that reinforces what I think, and I sort of stay in that space, and I sort of push other things out. So the varying reactions to whether businesses should be closed down or not, the whole story of vaccines, and are vaccines a good thing or are they really an evil thing? Don't tell me what to do with my life, it's my choice to make, versus you have an obligation to the society that you live in. So I think all of that, all of this and our reactions to it have sort of exacerbated this kind of, it's almost like a tribalism that goes on now, where everybody's in their tribe and they want to stay in their tribe, and they're very suspicious of anybody who they think thinks differently or acts differently or makes different choices, or that's trying to make choices for them. I'm not saying any of it's right or wrong. It's not a value judgment. I'm just saying I think it really exacerbated our societal divide right now. And I don't think anybody knows where that's going to go really, but it seems to really manifest itself continually in different ways. So I think out of that, particularly as being here in an educational institution, is what concerns me is the distrust of knowledge, like the distrust of science, that it's just a theory, that it's not a fact, or it's not my facts, it's your facts, and that facts can be different. I think that's troubling to me, just in terms of what we're about, in terms of learning and educating each other. So where we're going to go with that. There's a distrust of education in general in certain quarters. There's sort of pushback against initiatives that sometimes that seek for a more inclusive idea of what we could be or should be. That we experience all the time. We experienced it recently on the campus. So that's. I think that trajectory was happening anyway, but I can't help but wonder if the isolation and the way people had to interact and choose how they interacted because of COVID may have exacerbated it a little bit. So I think that's probably going to be a continuing concern, and we'll see how that plays itself out. We have lots of lessons from history of this happening before, so it's not like this is the first time in the world that things like this have happened, but I think we are going to have to figure out how we're going to navigate it, particularly here in a place where we're all about learning.
Real quick, you had mentioned a recent event on campus. Are you able to expound on that a little bit so we can have a bit of context for that?
Sure. So I was at the basketball game last Wednesday, not this past Wednesday, but Wednesday before, when as part of Black History Week there was a presentation of Lift Every Voice and Sing. Just to celebrate Black history and the meaningfulness of that particular piece to people of color. And so, out of this moment that was intended to honor people and be kind of cast a broader net of what we are as a place, at IUP or broadly. In one particular moment, one particular person made the decision to post something, on Snapchat that expressed, obviously, disapproval of that happening, which again was very hurtful to the people who saw it and received it, and so it created this place of conflict out of a very quick, could have been something that that person would never say out loud, but would feel free to say in the moment on social media, because that's the challenge of social media. And so so we've got this moment that was meant to be one thing that suddenly became something completely different. And it's something that we're still navigating, right now. I mean, there's been a lot of discussions on campus about it, and the fact that we're having discussions is the good part of a horrible thing that happened. How we navigate that in the future and get people to understand that there are consequences, whether they mean them or not, for things that are those kinds of things that are said, particularly things that would be viewed as racist in this case. And the other piece of it that is concerning for me, just in terms of learning, is that it does speak to, again, I'm not against social media by any means, but it does speak to the danger of social media, because one thing that someone might post in a brief moment as a reaction to something will stay with them for the rest of their lives, and once it's out in the world like that, you have no control of it. So out of this, I think I'm hoping we'll have a continuing discussion with each other about what happens when you do that, what can happen, whether you intend it to happen or not. So I think there's a big lesson there. But I will say I'm grateful for IUP and the way that we have come together to talk about this. It could have gone all sorts of different ways, but I think it went in a way that was as constructive as something could be out of that circumstance.
What impact did the pandemic have on your personal and or professional relationships?
I would say, for my personal relationships, it's a little bit like I had mentioned before. It's, there were people that I really maintained close contact and touch with. There are other people that I would only see if I was somewhere, that maybe I lost touch with a bit. And, I think, it's that kind of casual acquaintance, somebody you would just kind of hang out with, but you don't necessarily communicate with them all the time. And how do you kind of recreate those things or not, depending on where people have gone. Professionally, it's been interesting. I have found I serve on several professional associations, so there were actually some more frequent meetings because you could meet over Zoom. So you actually, in some ways, stayed more in touch with people who lived at a distance. But again, it's kind of a curated in touch thing. So I went to had a couple of in-person meetings and a conference for the first time, really since the pandemic, this past fall. And again, it was one of those experiences where being there, you realized what you were missing. I mean, you thought maybe you were missing something, but actually being in the moment and being with people and having conversations in the hallway and just gathering and, going out for dinner afterwards, all that stuff that you can do in that context that you couldn't do before, you realize how much you really missed that. and how much that is part of the importance of those kinds of professional gatherings like that. So I'm glad we're back to that. Although I went to one in St. Louis. I was there for 9 days this past fall. So I serve on an accreditation commission, and the first part was the meetings, and there was a COVID outbreak. So they actually flipped to Zoom for the last day and a half of the meeting. Everybody was supposed to stay in their hotel rooms, and and then everybody left. So it also spoke to the fragility of that, because again, it could go away. It also reminded me that we're at a point now where people are making choices. Like, we're not going to tell everybody that you have to stay in your room. It's sort of an advisory. You might want to consider putting a mask on again. You might not. I flew, and flew back. So when I flew out, I didn't wear a mask because you didn't have to in the airport, and I didn't wear one on the plane. When I flew back, I thought on the plane, well, maybe I should wear one now because I might have been exposed. So, it's just kind of how you personally decide to navigate those moments. So it's again, it goes back to my reflection on the word normal. I don't know what normal will be. And maybe the idea of normal is not something that we should hang on to. Maybe there is no normal.
In what ways do you think your experience relating to the pandemic has been similar or different compared to other people's experience?
Well, I think, I talked about this a little bit earlier too. I think people's experience with the pandemic varies profoundly by how personally affected they were. Like, I know people who've lost family members, who've lost a spouse, who've lost numbers of friends, so the effect of the pandemic for them is profound. It will leave a scar that they'll carry for the rest of their lives. There are other people that, and I would be among those who know of people, but no one close to me died of COVID. So I, grieve for the people that were lost, and I, certainly reach out for people that were close, who lost people that were close to them. But I think our experience somewhat relates to how it personally affected us. There are also people I know that, I know of at least 2 people that continue to have long-term COVID symptoms. So they no longer have COVID per se, but they also have this debilitating condition that they're still carrying and trying to navigate. So it's changed their lives in ways that they're still dealing with and figuring out what that's going to mean for their life. So in some ways it's become a long-term illness for them. So obviously it has a profound effect on them. So, so I feel that I've been pretty fortunate. I had 1 mild case of COVID, and that was it. And, I've gotten every COVID shot I could get. So I feel lucky for my own personal experience, but I'm old enough now to have lived through the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and early 90s, and had friends that died from that, and so I kind of have some experience with navigating the idea of an illness that really has serious effects for people. But I think the question will be now is how people continue to navigate it, in terms of the people that remain fearful will always wear a mask no matter what, will wear a mask outside no matter what, and people that don't even own one anymore and are never putting one on again. If it gets me, it gets me. People are just all over the place with how they want to move forward. But
what are some of the things that you felt you missed on because of the pandemic?
Oh, well, I think I missed on being able to participate in lots of things. So as I said, I was, I'm a singer. I do a little less solo work now, but I was still doing some choral singing. So, I couldn't do any of that anymore because nobody could. I didn't know if I'd ever do it again. So I think there's that. I think just some of those casual friendships that I mentioned, I feel like, I don't know that those will ever come back in the same way they did before. So certainly that. I think just that period where if we hadn't all been disrupted by COVID, what we might have collectively accomplished. I feel like it's set back so many things in terms of what students didn't get to experience. There's a whole almost two classes of students here at IUP that didn't have a normal college experience. There's students who were juniors or seniors in high school that didn't have all the rites of passage of graduating from high school. There's little kids who should have been in school learning to read that I don't know how they learned over Zoom, if at all. So I think there's a lot of those kind of collective things that are lost. So it's hard not to reflect on where would we be if that hadn't happened. But obviously it did, and we can't go back. We can just figure out how we're going to move forward.
What aspects of the pandemic life and now during the somewhat post-pandemic period have you enjoyed or disliked?
Well, let's see. I've enjoyed that. I've enjoyed that I out of the pandemic, I spent a little less time watching television and a little more time just listening to music and reading. And part of that was out of I stopped watching the news on television during the first part of the pandemic because I just didn't want to be told all the time about what it was and how I should think about it. So I sort of started to just read. So I would read newspapers every day and then just spend some time reading a book. I hadn't read like a book for fun to read in I don't know how long. So I enjoyed that part of kind of that it forced me to slow down a little bit and to just kind of spend a little time reflecting. Now some of that reflecting was worrying about, well, what's going to happen? But still, I think that was useful to me personally, just in terms of thinking, okay, you've got to take this time. And so I've tried to maintain that. So I think that's something that I'm trying to keep. I think, again, the thing that I disliked the most was just the societal and family impact of it, that people were separated, people couldn't gather for these important family things, like getting together for Christmas or whatever holiday you celebrate, that people couldn't do, that people lost relatives and couldn't go to the funeral because, there was a period where they were having like drive-by funerals. That was crazy. So just those kind of rites of passage things that are so important for everybody that were lost that you can't get back in real ways. I think that's what I worry about, that's lost, that people will never get back.
How did the pandemic impact the way you enjoy or engage with the world?
Well, that's sort of a broader question than the previous one. I think one of the things, at least for one of the things that we adapted to here at IUP is going back to the art side of things, as we did a lot more streaming. So you could sit in your house and you could watch a stream of all sorts of things that wouldn't have been streamed before. So you could see more concerts, you could see a play, you could see whatever you wanted to see. So there's much more of that. And a lot of that's continued. So I liked that. It's very convenient. The downside of it is, why should I go? I could just sit at home and, have a glass of wine and watch it on, my computer, on my television. So it's, so there's an upside and downside to it. But the idea that things are more, that you can go to more, like you can see something that would be in Europe somewhere. I don't have to travel there. I could see it more easily from where I am. That piece of sort of connecting the world more through the means that we can because of the internet and all the things that we can do with it, I like a lot because it broadened what we could do. the downside, the other side of that is you couldn't travel. So you couldn't actually go to these places. So if you're somebody, like I know somebody who recently retired and, and it was right around the pandemic, and they were all set to travel. They had saved all this money. They were wanting to really travel and go to these places they'd never gone to. Well, you couldn't do any of that. So, so they sort of missed out on that opportunity that they were really looking forward to. So now I'm hoping, now that we can travel again, and we can also, so we can sort of travel virtually a little easier and physically back to almost where we were, and, unless the plane gets canceled or your luggage gets lost. So I think that that's sort of the better outcome of what's occurred.
Mm-hmm. In your opinion, how has the IUP or Indiana community changed because of the pandemic?
Well, I think IUP has changed in terms of broadening how we think things can work. Now, so if you think of the student experience, so it kind of forced IUP into thinking that we could offer a few more courses online, that we could meet students where they want to be in terms of the type of learning that we could do, that we could find different ways of approaching subjects and bringing in different voices. We can, so I think we were forced to think differently, and a lot of that is good. In the community, I think I'm not quite sure. That's a good question, and I don't know for the community around IUP, how they're navigating. I mean, you can go out and you can see people out engaged again, and we're back to having all the community activities that happen in Indiana. For a relatively small town in Indiana, there's like a festival every other day, and particularly in the summer. So people are back out engaged in all those things. But I think the real thing for IUP is that it's kind of nudged us into thinking more creatively both through COVID and through as IUP's tried to, by necessity, right-size itself a little bit, that we've been able to try to do some very difficult things with a little more flexibility.
I know we already talked about a few, but would you like to share a memory about the pandemic that was significant to you?
Sure. Let's see. Well, let's go. I'll see if I can do a couple. The first goes back to singing again. Mm-hmm. So when it was the summer when things were just starting to open up, not this past summer, but the summer before, I sought out some place where I could be in a choir. So there's a sort of a summer professional choir that happens in Pittsburgh, and I knew the person that was the conductor. And so I thought, I just need to do this. I got to do this for myself. So I went, and we were all still kept masks on. But just the act of doing that was, I remember, it was like I was having a hard time not crying while I was doing it at first, because it was like, oh my God, I thought I'd never be able to do this again. And it's for any activity like that where it's so part of who you are, and you think you can never do it again, and all of a sudden you find that you can get back to it even a little bit, is really profound for people. So I think that was a particular moment for me, for sure. Strangely, another memory for me is when I decided I could come back to the office, because I said I really disliked working from home, and and because I was working up here, but not really at home. I should preface this, at home in Pittsburgh, our offices are right next to one another in sort of the same part of the basement, so we both couldn't have worked from home. So I would have been banished to like the kitchen on a stool or something. So the fact that I could come back to a place that felt somewhat normal, I guess I'm going to use the word normal, and actually go to a place to do a function, and not think do I have this thing or not? Am I going to spend the money to print this out, my own money to print it out or not? I could pick up the phone and call somebody. That was really like a moment where I thought, okay, maybe we are going to get on the other side of this. So it's a silly thing in some ways, but for how I was when I navigated it, it was really important to me to be able to do that thing.
Did you develop new ways to enjoy the world during the pandemic lockdown? And if so, what were they? Including like hobbies.
Yeah. Oh, hobbies. I need a hobby. I mean, I said I did get back to doing some reading, so I'm trying to keep that up. But it did make me think that it did make me reflect on the importance of developing some of those side interests, and so it reminded me that I actually need to start actively doing that more. So I think in terms of enjoying the world, it made me realize that as I get closer to what will be the next step of my life, that I want to start thinking ahead of time of what I want that to look like, but I don't want to suddenly be thrown into some big change and not know how I'm going to navigate it. So knowing that, because I'm, not all that far from retiring, so I'm thinking, okay, I want to make sure that I have a plan for that I know what I want to do with that I want that to be an exciting time for me. So I guess it helped me understand that I don't want to be caught, if I can help it, in a place where, oh my gosh, all of a sudden all the rules are gone and you just have to figure out what you're going to do.
Mm-hmm. How did you connect with other people during the peak of the pandemic?
Again, that was through a lot of Zooming. I wish I'd bought stock in Zoom. We Zoomed with families. We had a Zoom Thanksgiving. I did a Zoom happy hour with one of the offices on campus. I was home once, and that office was doing sort of a name that tune thing. It was actually a university advancement, and they were inviting different people to come in and do music, and people would name that tune. So it was like their own little game show. So I did it from home, and I played the piano, all these 70s tunes and 80s tunes, and had people, try to name them. So I think people found ways to do these, to connect and sort of replicate some of the things that they would do ordinarily. So again, it's kind of interesting to see, what we're going to keep. I'm connecting with an alum of Arts and Humanities who lives in New York that I'm very excited to talk to, and so now I'll actually suggest, well, why don't we do a Zoom, because we can actually see one another and talk, rather than, or in the old days I'd just pick up the phone.
Do you feel like your relationships with friends, neighbors, colleagues, and others are weaker or the same or stronger than before the pandemic?
I would say they're stronger with friends who are closer, because there was an intentionality about maintaining those relationships, and there was a real kind of almost joy in kind of reconnecting and like, okay, let's get together and do something, or whatever that looks like. I think the sort of the more casual relationships are the ones that I think are still, I mentioned before, are still kind of, some of them are there, sometimes you just kind of naturally drift away. For me personally, a lot of that was interesting anyway, because I spend most of the week up here in Indiana, and then I spend most every weekend in Pittsburgh. So even there is, I've sort of got these two sets of relationships now. So I'm trying to maintain the circle of friends I have in Pittsburgh, but I'm usually not there during the week. And then I've actually developed a circle of friends in Indiana. So it's almost, like having two homes. You've got friends here and friends there, and maybe they never get together. But I think those kind of tighter relationships are stronger.
What new skills or training did you learn because of the pandemic?
New skills or training. Well, I would say I'm more adept at. I've gotten a little bit more adept at using data, because I took the time to do that, so I can actually do an Excel spreadsheet better than I used to be able to. I mean, some things like, that you just don't take the time to do, and suddenly you had the time, and so, well, maybe I'll see if I could do this. And so, so I think some of the skills that I use in my work life are better because, they needed to be. The other thing is, you might, because we were all separated, even when we were working remotely, you could pick up the phone or you could try to connect, but again, I'm the type of person that would like to walk to the next office and say, hey, do you know how you do this? Or, and you couldn't do any of that. So I probably became a little more self-sufficient in some of those ways, which is good and bad, I suppose. So I think that's certainly been helpful just in terms of processes and things like that, and taking the time to actually learn them.
What, if anything, changed in how you interact with people at IUP, on the job and in the community?
I would say, I think there is a bond that develops from people that have been through a common challenging time. So I think that the group of people that sort of navigated this whole arc of what happened here, COVID and sort of all the reorganization of IUP that we're still evolving. But I think that has created somewhat of a bond through people that have had that experience. So I feel closer to many of my colleagues because of this, because of what we shared and tried to support each other and all of those things. In the community, it's different. Again, some of that has to do with what that relationship is. Here's a sort of home one. So when I'm home on the south side, there's restaurants and bars all over the place. So we hardly ever cook. We usually go to a restaurant to eat, particularly on the weekend. And we're people that, we tend to sit and eat at the bar. It's just more interesting, and you chat with the bartender. And so we would know the wait staff pretty well in all of these places that we normally go to. So, so we wouldn't see them, obviously, when they were closed. So seeing who was still there when they reopened and being happy to reconnect with them, being concerned about what their livelihood was or wasn't. So I think that was an interesting relationship that was kind of lost and then kind of recreated. But, it's not like, so in Indiana, it's the relationships I had were mostly through IUP, so they're pretty much the same.
What else would you like to share that we didn't ask about, or do you have a specific memory you would like to share from the pandemic?
I think we've covered almost everything. I think the thing I'd most like to share is that I'm glad that you're doing this project. Mm-hmm. I think it's tremendously important for people to have an understanding of what happened and how people navigated this experience for better or maybe less better, and what we can learn from that. Because things are always cyclical. There's bound to be something else, and so that people can learn from what we did. And I think it's also valuable for us to look back on what we did, because there's people have various levels of things that they carry with them because of this, and to take the time to look back and realize what all of us went through together in varying ways, I think is really important. So I think so I'm just very glad that you're doing this.
How would you relay your experience of the pandemic to future generations?
Well, I think number one is what we just talked about. I think that this having this kind of an archive and having people's stories archived is tremendously important. And I think also just taking the time, what we don't do collectively and is tell each other our stories, and so to even take the time to find times to talk about what was this experience for you, and how did you do this, and how did that affect you, and just to kind of reach out at a more personal level and share what those experiences are, because everybody's is a little different. And some people's were very profound, some people were a little less touched, but everybody carries something with that, and so, helping, I think it's part of our understanding each other, is understanding, what we've been through, and particularly for people who have been profoundly affected, who almost carry some form of PTSD about it, to take the time to really listen to them and understand why this has profoundly affected them is important.
Are there experiences or mindsets that would help us navigate a future crisis?
Well, I think the mindset piece is to me is the most important, because I think what has come out of this, and I've talked about this a little bit before, is a higher level of mistrust that came out. It's one of the negative things that came out. There are obviously positive things and interactions and flexibility and all of that stuff. But the level of mistrust of information, of science, of being able to listen to one another, of not thinking that I'm right and you're wrong, and I don't want to hear anything from you because you're wrong, because this is what I believe and it's right because I believe it. I think that's the danger of all of this, and I think for people to understand, again, the consequences that happen, that when we don't engage with one another, we just we inevitably come I think we basically get stuck. We all get stuck because nobody wants to give in, nobody wants to have a conversation, nobody wants to hear an idea that's other than their own. And so the idea that compromise is a possibility becomes very difficult. And again, you can think of history and you can think of all sorts of examples when this has happened before. And it's one of those things we never quite seem to learn from, but I think we always have to keep trying.
Are there any questions that you wish we would have asked you about your experience at IUP or Indiana community during the pandemic?
None that I can think of. I think these are very good questions, and I think they're well thought through, and I'm very glad to have had this conversation.
Thank you. Is there anything else you would like us to know?
I look forward to seeing the rest of these archives, and I think to make this, I'm hoping you'll make this really publicly available so that other people can experience it, and I think it's important. So thank you.
That's pretty much it.
All right.